Quite a while ago, someone showed me this review in the Guardian newspaper, a retrospective 20 years on about the children's film Shrek. The review is terrible. It shows a lack of understanding of narrative structure and substitutes the critic's subjective experience. They really did not enjoy Shrek for anything that might actually be informative for the reader. And it seems to want to blame this one film for the collapse of Western civilization. We'll leave aside the misuse of classics. No, actually we won't. Words mean things, and if you don't know what they mean, you shouldn't use them. Classics is a term used to refer to a specific example in a canonized body of work. Disney's Beauty and the Beast could be considered a classic of the Disney Renaissance in the 90s, precisely because it is a specific work. But the rough outline of the story of Beauty and the Beast, or in fact of any generic fairy tale, is not a classic. To give another example, the story of Ram, the ancient Indian hero who is exiled to the forest and who fights with and kills the demon Ravana to recover his wife, is not a classic. There are many different versions of that story, the Ramayana. In fact, there's a famous article about how many different versions of that story there are. And while the story is culturally important and ubiquitous, not every version, simply by virtue of being a Ramayana, is a classic. But the earliest surviving version of it, the Valmiki version, and the influential Tulsidas version in the 16th century, those are certainly classics. I'm getting ahead of myself here. Obviously, the thing I was just talking about was that Guardian review and how bad I thought it was. And yes, this is going to be an episode about the Ramayana and about literary criticism for historians. But before I actually get to that, I think I probably ought to say a few more things about Shrek and that review and what the problem with it was. Let us begin with the scene which seems to have so enraged and been so fundamentally misunderstood by the Guardian critic.
Once upon a time there was a lovely princess, but she had an enchantment upon her of a fearful sort, which could only be broken by love's first kiss. She was locked away in a castle, guarded by a terrible fire-breathing dragon. Many brave knights had attempted to free her from this dreadful prison, but none prevailed. She waited in the dragon's keep, in the highest room of the tallest tower, for her true love and true love's first kiss. Like that's ever gonna happen. What a load.
Okay, so this is Film Language 101, but it's worth putting the groundwork in here. The scene occurs at the opening of the film, and as such, it is attempting to set our expectations for the rest of the movie. And it's not very subtle about doing that. This is, after all, a movie for children. We are literally listening to the plot of the movie. What Shrek, the character, reads here is what happens in Shrek the movie. Yes, we would expect some irreverent twists on the formula. Having an ogre on the toilet read it to us is a pretty good signal for that. But the film is up front that this is a fairy tale. And that is not the only thing the scene is doing. Shrek is the protagonist of the film, and protagonists need a character arc, or at least they're expected to have one in the culture that this film was made in. Character needs to grow and change over the course of the film, which for children means establishing a flaw that is to be overcome by the end. Shrek does not believe in fairy tales. He believes that love's true kiss is silly and ridiculous. And this is the thing the Guardian's film critic appears not to understand, but almost everyone who saw the movie did. The film and the character are at odds on this point. The film thinks Shrek is wrong, and it shows this through the culmination of his character arc. Yes, that's right. The culmination of the film is love's true kiss, and Shrek's arc is completed by not only buying into that idea, but metaphorically accepting fairy tales in the form of all the fairy tale creatures into his swampland home. Even more so, the film's quite upfront about this by essentially paralleling a very similar scene in a much more straightforward telling of Beauty and the Beast. The film is not, as the critic suggests, promoting a destructive, know-it-all attitude, but rather actively encouraging the audience to engage earnestly with the very fairy tale stories it is based on. And you don't need to have a lot of critical knowledge to see this. It's the kind of understanding you would arrive at simply by having watched the same number of movies as the average child attending a screening of Shrek. And even if you were approaching a culture that you had no experience of, and this form of media was completely alien to you, it's possible to acquire an understanding through study. Actually, cinematic criticism is a little bit unusual in the Academy. Uniquely, I think there's probably enough high quality material on YouTube for you to acquire a research level understanding of that field. Sure, you'd still need to put in the 10,000 plus hours of focused self-reflective study, but the raw tuition is out there, and that's probably because film students were very early adopters of the video essay format. Okay, my videos are about history, not criticism, so now that I've got that little bit out of the way about Shrek, where is this going? What is it that I want to say here about criticism that's relevant to a historian? Well, that's what I'll try and explain next. Media criticism is actually quite a useful skill for historians. We don't have a lot of choice in the sources we use. The extant material is literally whatever survives. And that is not usually the kinds of administrative records Leopold von Ranke thought were ideal. Especially for pre-modern historians, you work with what you have. And that is often works that can be subject to criticism. Literature, sculpture, painting, and so on. That's leaving aside the argument many historians have made in the last 40 years that almost all written works, even modern formal histories, have a literary quality, that they employ allusion, tropes, metaphor, plot, or other literary devices for their effect. In my general reading, which is just one of the things you do broadly around your area of interest, I've read a lot of literature. In particular, for a number of years, I've been keeping a review blog of an ongoing translation project called the Murty Classical Library, which produces English versions of what it argues, sometimes generously, are the classics of South Asian literature. Though relatively recent, this is a project with a bit of a history, so let's rewind a little. There has been an ongoing project to systematically translate Latin and Greek literary works for over a century, intended for a general audience. The Loeb, or Loeb, I really am not sure how you pronounce his name, is over 500 volumes in size and was inaugurated in 1911 by the philanthropy of an American, James Loeb. Without this series, the English publication of Greek and Latin texts would probably be, as many South Asian ones are, quite ad hoc, with more popular texts being favoured. After all, a publisher wants to make money, and while the Loeb sells a lot of copies of Cicero or Aristotle, they probably don't sell enough to make financial sense of an obscure playwright like Menander. As we will see, that is both the strength of having a series and its biggest weakness, the range of translations and the dependency on subsidy for survival. These kinds of series are not entirely unknown in South Asian studies. The Pali Text Society has been publishing translations of Buddhist material since 1881. But today's story begins with the Clay Sanskrit Library, founded by John Clay, which published very briefly but prolifically from 2005 to 2008. The Clay series is modelled directly on the Loeb, and I have to admit I'm a big fan of the handy size of the volumes. It has had both proponents and detractors, the latter of whom pointed to its often poor editing, reprinting of existing work, and weird decisions for transcription. Clay collapsed with several works incomplete. New funding was ultimately found, but not, unfortunately, to continue and expand, but rather to replace, from the son of a rich industrialist, Rohan Murty. Thus, the Murty Classical Library, which began publication in 2015. In terms of scholars, this project draws pretty much on the same pool of academics as the Clay, but there are some differences. At an obvious level, this is not based around a single language, as both the Lurb and the Clay series were, which makes sense as a decision given the linguistic variety of an area as large as South Asia, and the degree to which tellings of stories like the Ramayana borrow back and forth between versions in multiple languages. There is also a difference in presentation. It feels like the Murty, with its emphasis on flashy design, over scholarly detail, and oversized and somewhat unwieldy volumes, is out to prove the value of its works, that they deserve to be called classics, while the Clay and the Lurb rather assume that. Will the Murty succeed as a project? It's obviously open to a lot of doubts. The series began with the rather modest goal of publishing 5 volumes a year. It seems to be struggling to reach 4. There are big practical challenges. Preparing new volumes is expensive, might take many years. Many will not recoup their costs, and those that do are unlikely to generate enough surplus to fund a steady rate of new volumes. And unfortunately, you cannot afford to just publish new volumes. From a purely practical point of view, quality varies and scholarship moves on, and some volumes become outdated and need to be replaced. I don't possess the skills to evaluate all the existing volumes, but it's worth noting that at least one, The Poems of Mia, is so badly compromised in its translation that it already needs replacing. The Clay project collapsed under this financial reality. The Lurb project came very close to doing so in the 1970s and has only survived as a going concern by reducing its production of new volumes to an anemic trickle. These things are never self-sustaining. They need philanthropy, which, however valuable they are, is presumably hard to attract if someone else's name is permanently attached to the project. Anyway, this isn't a video about the financial woes of academia. It's about applying literary criticism to historical texts. As I said, I have been reading volumes and publishing one-page reviews every few months as a sort of blog since the Murty began. I haven't actually done any for a while, but, I will get back to it. In some cases, works are long enough they need multiple volumes, and those multi-volume works include, at the moment, 2 versions of the story of the hero Ram and his conflict with the demon Ravana. The older, The Life of Padma, from the 10th century, presents the story in a Jain context, while the latter, and more famous, the Ramcharitmanas, is a devotional Hindu work, presenting Ram as the ultimate divine recourse. And this is the famous version of Tulsidas. These two are very different works, and my experience of reading them is very different. I'm not terribly keen on the Tulsidas version. I certainly would not say I'm enjoying it. I find it a dull, pedantic, plodding chore, repetitious, turgidly placed, and centred around an unsympathetic and unchanging central character, with an insipid doormat for a romantic interest. The contrast of Ram Sita with Shrek Fiona could not be more marked. And a central message wholly at odds with the worldview of any reasonable person. No, I'm not keen on this at all. But, and here I think is the first and most important rule of criticism, my enjoyment is not a measure of the work's quality. Tulsidas' version of the Ramayana is one of the most widely read and highly regarded, and it is those things for a reason. And that central insight, lost apparently on our Guardian critic, is that something can possess objective qualities independent of your subjective experience is absolutely central, and something historians need as much as literary critics. Once you recognise that, it opens up a potentially interesting avenue of investigation. Why did this appeal to a 16th century audience in a way it doesn't appeal to me? What am I missing? And it is always that I am missing something. I can't write off the fans of the Ramcharitmanas as simply religiously motivated to overlook its shortcomings, though that it is an overtly devotional take on Ram is actually important. The translator, Philip Lugendorf, offers one potential explanation for my lack of enjoyment, suggesting it might have something to do with the act of translation. On the work's language, he writes, Tulsi's vocabulary is indeed immense, and he is often credited with having expanded the lexicon of what would become modern Hindi through his revival and adaptation of Sanskrit loanwords. And on this point, Lugendorf makes a distinction between the original language and the translation. English has more than one verb for seeing, the most important and recurrent act in which Manas characters engage, especially seeing the unworldly beauty of Ram and Sita. But it does not have, as I have counted in the Balkand alone, 14. Yeah, actually English kind of does. I was able to think of half a dozen synonyms off the top of my head, and more than 14 fairly easily without resorting to any sort of lookup tool, and I filled this page without using archaicisms, regionalisms, neologisms, or the borrowings Tulsidas did. English does just fine for synonyms, but, and this I suspect is what they are trying to get at, Lugendorf isn't the poet Tulsidas is, and it is unreasonable to expect him to be. He is impressively multilingual and a South Asian specialist of some ability, but to expect him to also have a Shakespearean command of English to match the text's Tulsidian command of Hindi would be too much. And that point can be generalised. The translation is not the original. Its poetic quality is limited by the poetic talents of its translator, who, if we are to accept that Tulsidas was a once-in-a-millennium master of his craft, is always going to fall short. In fact, Lugendorf doesn't even really try. There is no attempt to replicate metre, rhythm, alliteration, or other literary effects in English. And we can get a sense of how much is lost in that process by listening to a performance of the Ramcharitmanas. It's worth saying this, that while Tulsidas was literate and composed using writing, his work was intended to be recited to an audience. One presumes initially by the poet himself and subsequently by professional singers. The recitation I'm playing in the background is by a famous modern professional singer, Chanulala Mishra, excerpts of whose performances are readily available online. Hopefully you can recognise immediately, even if like me you have no familiarity with the language, that there are all sorts of elements in that performance that would improve my experience, that I cannot get from reading the translation. It is akin to reading the screenplay for Shrek and assuming that your experience is essentially that of the movie. Sure, you're still going to get the basic elements of Shrek's character arc and how it functions to serve the movie's message about the value of contemporary retellings versus faithful reverence for old stories, but you're not going to enjoy it in quite the same way. Of course, some works can survive the act of translation better than others. They can preserve in their new medium and language enough of the original's qualities, or they can find some new connection with the audience. And for some people, that ability to transcend its original context is what makes a work a classic. But let us turn to the central theme of this version of the Ramayana story, which I think, leaving aside the problems of performance, is one of the things that really puts me off. That central theme is pretty hard to miss, because every exchange in the poem boils down to know your place. In Tulsidas' world, your place is not hard to establish. If you are not a man who was born into power and wealth, then your place is grovelling at the feet of men who did not earn their power or wealth. This is exemplified in the character of Ram, who behaves pretty consistently like a spoilt brat, but whose every action is constantly praised and exalted. Ram does not earn adoration through his actions, but rather he is entitled to adoration because of who he is. But it applies to all the characters. So we get self-effacing remarks attributed to the people of the forest. And they go like this. Kirat hospitality is but firewood and leaves, and our greatest service to you is to not steal your clothes and cooking pots. We are dull folk, slayers of living beings, crooked, wicked, ignorant and low-born. We pass our days and nights in sinful deeds, without a scrap of clothing or full stomachs. This is not a host's self-effacing humility. Tulsidas literally puts the kind of prejudiced slurs an outsider might use of the Kirat into their own mouths. Remember, know your place. Tulsidas is a deeply conservative artist who genuflects to authority and the social hierarchy he no doubt benefited from in his own lifetime. But the experience of that theme is very different for a modern reader than it would be for a 16th century listener. And here we begin to elide the difference between criticism and historical analysis. To us, the theme is abhorrent. Modern readers almost all live in societies that formally espouse a meritocratic ideology, however they actually work in practice. But for a 16th century Indian audience, Tulsidas is simply describing reality. The audience did not live in a meritocratic society, they lived in one where power and wealth were never earned, where extreme discrimination was often legislated for. For me, my experience is marred by what I can only read as Tulsidas' advocacy for such a system. But for a 16th century listener, it is not advocacy, it's just the background noise of everyday life. Knowing your place is something that they have to do just to get through the day. What marks the text out for that listener is the role that devotion to Ram plays in relation to knowing your place. And this is as frequently repeated in the text as the defence of social hierarchy. Even today, if one's heart just dreams of sheltering those wanderers, Lakshman, Sita and Ram, one finds the way to Ram's abode, a path that even sages rarely attain. Know your place and devote yourself to Ram, and you will be rewarded. For an audience constantly reminded of their place, the experience of the poem, beyond its melodic qualities, is dictated by the promise that regardless of what that place is, their devotion to Ram will ensure their spiritual liberation. Context matters. In fact, this is a point the general editor for the series was keen to make when it launched. One of the first questions that needed to be answered was what exactly makes a classic? The honest answer is, of course, the process of canonization, which a series like this, if it is successful, is engaged in, i.e. a work is a classic because the classical library published an edition. But that is rather circular, and the editors at least needed a notional idea of what criteria might justify inclusion. Since the timelessness or universality of such material would be hard to argue, and is often perceived as a false Eurocentric justification for privileging Latin and Greek texts, so would be quite inappropriate in the context of a series on South Asian texts, it is not surprising that the editors leant the opposite way, into context. And Pollock writes, "It might in fact be their very resistance to contemporaneity and universality that is their capacity to communicate the vast variety of the human past. There will, of course, be many occasions for learning something about our shared humanity from these works, but they also provide access to radically different forms of human consciousness. It's an interesting idea, but it is, of course, one that requires us, as readers, to apply a critical sense, to be open to the idea that there are other experiences of a work than our own, not just that our experience is one amongst many, but in a sense that there are objective qualities to a work which supersede our immediate response to it, which explain that work's success with both its original and subsequent audiences. As in the case of Shrek, the first rule of criticism is that you cannot understand a work if you judge it solely by your own response to that work."